Hi, and welcome to another daily cinephile vlog. And today we're going to talk about a movie, which is something that appeared on Netflix today, but it is not actually a Netflix movie, if that makes any sense. It's actually about Blockbuster. A movie about Blockbuster appeared on Netflix. It's called The Last Blockbuster. It was not produced by Netflix, but it did make its debut on Netflix today. It has been available elsewhere, I believe, in some capacity before it finally appeared on Netflix today, but for the most part, people are going to be catching it for the first time through Netflix. So it's about Blockbuster, one of the last ones that survive in Bend, Oregon. The very last Blockbuster that's still open, operating, where you can still actually rent movies. And the documentary also just goes over the history of Blockbuster, some of the reasons that it closed down, and just video store memories in general. I was very excited for the documentary. As some of you know, I do love the video store. So, obviously something like this kind of got me excited. Just to, people going over their love for movies, the concept of the video store, and just nostalgia for Blockbuster in general. It was a pretty good documentary. I really like the stuff where they actually went over the history of Blockbuster, some of its weird corporate decisions, and how it ended up falling apart, which a lot of people believe it's because of just Netflix happening and the advent of streaming services in general, which, would kind of make sense in theory. I think timing-wise, if you know about what point Blockbuster really started to shut down, which, we had one in our area around 2012 that closed down. And, before that, the real big hit was the 2008 financial crisis. But a lot of people always say it's just because the streaming services came through and started to become more popular than Blockbuster. And it's like, that's part of it, but, for the most part, I didn't know too many people that had Netflix streaming at that point. I knew some people that used the mailing, but, even that was never as big as the streaming was. And at that point, when Blockbuster started to really fall apart, streaming was still not becoming as big or even as accessible. I mean, internet options were still, they were growing, but they were still somewhat limited, especially in rural areas. I think the reason that it fell apart was, like, if you watch the documentary, a lot of it had to do with corporate issues, the 2008 financial crisis, and just limited cash flow, which was not really even specifically because Blockbuster was failing. It had a lot to do with just who owned them at the time and what a lot of the proceeds that were coming from Blockbuster ended up going towards. Viacom owned them at the time, and, everything that Blockbuster was making was not really going back into Blockbuster. It ended up going into other ventures. So I was kind of happy it went into all that. And overall, yeah, it was pretty good. But I had some issues with it. And I liked the documentary, but I guess my primary concern with it, and well, the biggest thing that it goes into is about the Bend, Oregon location, how it ended up becoming the only one that survives, and it just kind of became a heartwarming story about that at the end, especially about how it's kind of jumped in popularity because now it's the only Blockbuster, and now there's been kind of a niche surrounding it because of nostalgia and merchandise and things like that. But I think one of the reasons I kind of got bothered by the documentary was there seems to be a bit too much nostalgia for Blockbuster. Now, when they're talking to the individuals, they are always talking about the video stores in the term of, in terms of video stores in general, not really specifically Blockbuster. They're talking about mom and pop stores, and they do bring up the fact that Blockbuster caused a lot of those to fall to the wayside. Blockbuster kind of came into town and caused a lot of the hometown videos to fall apart. which is kind of, on Blockbuster's part, it's dirty business tricks, but it's business as usual, but in a way it makes them kind of look awful. And I don't think the point ever really got across enough that, Blockbuster's practices in general, not just from bad business decisions later that caused it to fall apart, but, just the whole image of Blockbuster really helped to tank it as well. A lot of people didn't have positive views about Blockbuster. A lot of it had to do because of the late fees, which they do bring up. There were other issues though, and Blockbuster just never really had a positive aura around it. There seems to be at a certain point in the documentary where they make it seem like, it was pretty neck and neck with Netflix at one point, where had Blockbuster stuck around and not been at an unfair disadvantage due to other, financial issues, it probably could have had a better chance against Netflix and maybe even stuck around. But I almost don't really agree with that suggestion, only because I think Blockbuster was doomed to begin with because of its business practices and its overall, the way people viewed it. Even nowadays, a lot of people look back on it now as like, hey, Blockbuster, I remember that, but that was just because it was one of the only video stores around, because it caused so many other video stores to fall apart that it ended up becoming the only video store. And now a lot of people's memories are only with Blockbuster. Blockbuster has become synonymous with saying video store at all. Like, if you bring up video stores, you're bringing up Blockbusters. But if you actually ask people about Blockbusters in general, people never really have positive comments. And I feel like the documentary kind of glosses over that part. And I think it's cool that the Bend, Oregon location has kind of found its own niche in the market and has turned the Blockbuster brand into something else, something to make merchandise out of, to really bank on that nostalgia of the brand. Because, like the like logo is very nice. The color schemes are very nice, but the actual company itself was never what I would consider, great. I don't think a lot of people who are in love with movies really loved Blockbuster. I even knew that Blockbuster wasn't that great compared to some of the others. Like, we used to have a hometown video store in our small town that had a lot of older movies at it. And, it was all VHS tapes. It was kind of the reason that it closed, was just because, it never really was able to keep up with the transition to DVD. There were other reasons why it closed, but for the most part, that was like one of the primary reasons. It just never got too much into DVDs. Most of its catalog was VHS, and it just never really had a chance to convert everything. But I always loved that video store because they had a lot of older stuff that was, not easy to find if you didn't have, well, at that time, the only thing is cable. If you would have had cable or satellite TV and it possibly was airing somewhere, or if you had on demand. But at that point, streaming services didn't really exist. The idea of finding a movie through some service that you could like borrow online wasn't really a thing at the time. And unless you had Netflix, you could just, mail it to yourself, the movie of like any kind. Otherwise, you were out of luck. And if you went to a store that had the old movies, then you might be able to catch them. But Blockbuster never really carried all the old movies. It's kind of funny too, like Netflix, which, the mailing service is kind of forgotten at this point. But it always seemed dumb to do the mailing of a DVD. I don't know why at the time that seemed so stupid to me and to so many people. It just seemed like why would we wait days for that? Looking back, I totally get it now, especially since, even nowadays it exists, and it might even still be worth it nowadays, just for certain movies that still are only available on physical format, that isn't found on like streaming services or even available to purchase or rent on Amazon. There's movies that are in here that are still only available on Blu-ray or DVD that are not available on any streaming service or even on renting services, which is crazy. Everything should be accessible online at this point, and some of this stuff still isn't. But I had that issue with Blockbuster even as a kid, where they just didn't have everything. And on top of that was the late fees, on top of the fact that it also was located in a city that was farther away from us. So, people who lived in really small towns technically got screwed because, yeah, if you're someone like me who comes from a small town near a bigger city where you gotta travel to that bigger city to really access anything, not a big problem, you just gotta plan your trip. But the only problem with renting something is that, you gotta plan for bringing it back. So you always had to think about that. I know we'd always go to Blockbuster. We could choose movies, but we'd always have to do I'm pretty sure there was a deal where you could borrow 3 movies and have it for 5 nights. It was something like that. And, we always had to make sure we got so many movies, and then we had to make sure to remember we got to return these movies, or, my dad would be working in that town, so remember to bring the movies with him in the morning when he's leaving so he can remember to drop them off so he wouldn't get those late fees. And, there's video stores in general have an inconvenience to them. There's a nostalgia around video stores. I mean, honestly, if you want to be real, it was pretty inconvenient. I don't think it's a business model that could have really survived at all, given that there's streaming services. And yeah, you can buy so many movies online too nowadays that you can keep forever, especially those who love movies, which the only reason I think a video store would stay open is if you really love movies. Those people would keep them alive, but most of those people are like me, who are just buying the movies I am here. And even then, I have so many streaming services, and I agree, streaming services are way better than having to try to find a movie to buy or to rent physical copies of. I love physical copies of media. I always will. I've gone over that before, why I like Blu-ray way more than streaming, but man, it has gotten a lot better versus what Blockbuster ever was, especially before I started collecting movies. It was always difficult for so many reasons, but yeah, so Blockbuster always had this very corporate look to it, where it was like the Walmart of video stores, which, Walmart, yeah, it has everything, or it has a lot, and, it's kind of one place to shop, but there's also just this feeling of, dirtiness to it. I don't know. Blockbuster, from what I always remember, it never felt as special as the video store that was located in our small town, or some of the other smaller chains, or other local video stores that were in the area. So I guess my whole point about that was just, I feel like they don't go into that enough about the actual issues with Blockbuster beyond their financial issues and, the reasons that they actually close, which, yes, it's not necessarily just because of Netflix. I'm glad they brought that up. But they also really don't bring up what everyone's legit issues with Blockbuster was. I think there's better videos on YouTube where they talk about Blockbuster and yeah, it's great that, there's nostalgia around it. And yeah, I have nostalgia for it, but honestly, a lot of it isn't positive. It seems like the only dissenting voice in this entire documentary was Lloyd Kaufman. And Lloyd Kaufman, was not a fan of Blockbuster. They wouldn't carry the Troma movies. There's a lot of movies that Blockbusters wouldn't carry. He kind of brings up it's mostly the ones that were from the corporate end, not the franchisees, that wouldn't carry Troma movies. But it's glossed over really quick, and they kind of almost make a joke out of him, and I just feel like it was kind of disservice to him, because I think he had a lot more interesting stuff to say about Blockbuster versus how this documentary portrayed it. It's almost like, Blockbuster is still a brand that's owned by Dish, so it's almost like, because they had to get rights to the logos for this movie and a lot of stuff about Blockbuster's history and such, they probably got permission from Dish, but there was probably also this, but we're not going to get too mean about them, or we're going to play it nice. And also, we're going to talk about the Bend, Oregon location, but we don't want everyone to hate Blockbuster, because it's going to screw over the Bend, Oregon location, all the merchandise they're selling, which is great. I think Bend, Oregon's location is great. I really like what they're doing now, and I would say the Blockbuster brand is in a better place now than where it was, in the late 2000s, because I think there is just a more positive aura surrounding it. And I like what Bend, Oregon's doing. But it's obvious to me that the documentary was trying to hide that. The documentary was trying its best not to dig too much into people's criticisms of Blockbusters and how they operated. I think it would have been better if they would have interviewed a lot more employees and, you know, they could have brought up how they had their own issues. I would say go read individual reviews of people talking about this movie, and a lot of people have really interesting stories about Blockbuster. So I guess that's kind of my sum up of it. It's a good documentary just for a trip down memory lane, and definitely a lot of nostalgia there and a lot of memories. And you know, the stuff about Bend, Oregon is very heartwarming. Like, I really do like that story and about that manager, about that whole community. But I really wish they would have, you know, been a little more honest about people's true thoughts about Blockbuster, because like I said, yeah, people are talking positively about Blockbuster, but they're talking more positively about just the video store in general. And on top of that, even when people are talking positively about the video store, it also doesn't seem like they're, you know, attacking the video store as much, you know, or bringing up the fact that sure, there's streaming nowadays, and sure, there's like there's something different about it being tangible, but overall things are better now. Like, I don't think we should return to the video store. I think the Bend, Oregon location is great, and I like video stores to a point. I mean, they kind of exist still as libraries, just for movies that are a little more harder to access, and it seems like Bend, Oregon is doing that for that community. A lot of people can access movies that maybe aren't available on streaming services, and that's great, but for the most part, it's like, you know, I miss the aesthetic, and I miss the tangible idea of walking to a video store and looking for movies, and just the fact that there was a whole building devoted to movies that way. But things are better now. So that was me just talking about the last Blockbuster. It just kind of went a lot longer than I thought it would. But if you like me rambling like this, like the video, give it a comment, subscribe to this channel and to my main channel for even better quality videos, and use the bell icon for both, because YouTube is after me, just like Blockbuster was after the mom and pop stores. Thanks for watching.